So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, folks, for joining us here. Beautiful day in Hanover. So both here in Hanover and online, we're very happy to have you with us. I'm Dr. Melody Brown Berkins, Director of the Institute of Arctic Studies in the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, and it is my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this talk today, a talk co-sponsored by the Institute of Arctic Studies and Dartmouth's Institute for Black Intellectual and Cultural Life, Global to Grassroots, Youth Leadership and Climate Justice in the Arctic and Beyond, given by my friend and colleague, Michaela Stith. So now I get to say good things about her. Michaela is someone from whom I have learned quite a lot. She's an author, an advocate, an organizer, whose voice is helping redefine what climate justice leadership looks like in the Arctic and around the world. You'll see during her talk today that her story and voice are invaluable and timely as the Arctic and our planet face complex and sometimes overwhelming challenges of rapid climate change, rising inequality, and environmental injustice. Her work and her voice address these intersecting, complicated issues, connecting her knowledge of environmental science, of racial injustice, of Indigenous rights, grassroots advocacy, and international cooperation together. For a bit of history, you'll probably hear Michaela grew up in Alaska and is a first-generation college graduate of Duke, where she earned her degree in environmental science and policy and graduated with distinction. She earned a prestigious Hart Fellowship, which took her to Tromsø, Norway, to serve with the Arctic Council Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, and she supported Arctic Indigenous Peoples' engagement in multilateral diplomacy, an experience that shaped her commitment to decolonizing climate policy and centering Indigenous knowledge and priorities in global affairs, which she'll tell you more about today. After this work, she spent time at the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, a prestigious institute in D.C. that was sadly closed down by executive order only a few weeks ago, but had provided nonpartisan counsel and insights on global affairs to policymakers. And she'd been hired and worked there for the Polar Institute's director, Dr. Michael Sfraga, who later became the first U.S. ambassador at large for Arctic affairs. Michaela there had organized over 25 public events about the Arctic, managed scholarly publications, produced a blog called Polar Points, handled the Polar Institute's social media, and I think the Institute's new security beat column, Navigating the Poles. And in the midst of all of this, you see it up on the screen, she wrote and self-published a book about her work in the Arctic, Welp, Climate Change and Arctic Identities, a travel memoir exploring the intersections of climate change, racism, and identity across Alaska, Iceland, and Norway. And again, she'll tell you more, but I guess I do want to say how inspired I've been by this book. I won't read everything, but she did let me put a little blurb on the back that says, Melody Berkins says, "It is inspiring, open, honest, and approachable while managing complex, challenging, and difficult issues from the personal to the global with real sensitivity and insight." I had so much fun reading this book. It's a perfect weekend read. I've read it, I probably read it 2 or 3 times, and I was just flipping through it again today and enjoying so much. So I've followed Michaela's career, continue to follow her work and her leadership. I'm indebted to her for her coming to my class. She's actually part of my syllabus of the environmental studies class, The Practice of Science, Policy, and Diplomacy. And I bring her in the last week of term to speak to my students about her work, about writing her book, and about how she uses her voice to make needed change in the world. I hope my students see their own voices and dreams of being informed advocates and activists in her path, to recognize they also have a voice, perhaps a book, that might inspire others and spark or drive change. Her lecture to my class is a true gift, and it's my honor to help share this gift of her voice with all of you today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to author, activist, youth leader, and inspiration, Michaela Stith. That was fun to write.
So nice. Thanks so much for having me and for joining. I know it is beautiful outside, so it means a lot to me for you all to be here. I wanted to start by asking, are any of you interested in going abroad after graduation, or staff who are ready to bail ship? I think I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about why I was interested in the international side of work that started my career. I recall back all the way in 7th grade, geography class, we were assigned to write a travel brochure about any country in the world. And while my family was always like dreaming of tropical vacations down south, I was looking east and west at other places across the Arctic, because Alaska is a beautiful, amazing place. And unfortunately, we also have a lot of systemic problems. Like at the time that I was graduating, 90% of our state income tax came from oil and gas companies, so a very monopolized type economy. We also had some of the highest rates of incarceration in the country, some of the highest rates of gender-based violence, and also of gun violence. And part of that is because we have such a small population that the numbers are a little bit inflated, but it was very obvious to me growing up. And I just wanted to see a better future for Alaska. And when I had this brochure, I started learning about Iceland and Norway and Finland, these places that were known for their gender equity. I learned that Iceland had its first female prime minister back in the 1980s, and that they were really committed to addressing climate change, and 96% of Iceland's electricity came from geothermal energy. And so I figured that if we had such similar landscapes, you know, these volcanic activity, the glacier-full mountains, that what was so different? And why couldn't we have those same opportunities? And ultimately, it made me very interested in policy and politics, because I think that the policies that dictate where you live have a lot to do with the opportunities that you can have and the conditions that we live under. And so as I grew older, I became more interested in the Arctic Council. I'll read this little blurb from my book that just gives you an idea of where I was growing up. Over 100 languages are spoken in the Anchorage School District, like Hmong, Yupik, Tagalog, Sudanese, Spanish, and Samoan. The city is overwhelmingly white, about 2/3 of the population, but the remainder manifests every color of the racial rainbow. 6% Black, 9% Asian, 3% Samoan, 6% Latinx, 9% Alaska Native. Other than Hawaii, mixed-race people, like myself, are more common in Alaska than in any other state. I remember hearing Samoans playing the ukulele, not ukulele, as I roamed the hallways on my first day of high school. Over 1,000 students watched Hawaiian girls perform hula at a pep rally, and then I ate plantains at my Dominican friend's house after school. And it goes on, talking about how at a friend's party who was Yupik and Aleut, we ate fry bread and ice cream made of Alaskan blueberries and cold seal fat. And at a Korean friend's party, we ate pork belly barbecue. Unlike resegregated schools across the United States, West Anchorage High School was teeming with people of all races from all over. In fact, West was the 5th most diverse high school in the United States, following Bartlett and East, which are also in Anchorage. Consider that I grew up in this tableau of people from all over, but the state of Alaska is very much overwhelmingly white in our House, in our Senate, in our governor's seat. And I recognize that the reason why we were lacking so many opportunities and services, a lot had to do with us not being represented in our government and not seeing themselves in those of us who needed more opportunity. So the Arctic Council was interesting to me in that it was the only international governance body that I knew of that allowed indigenous peoples to sit at the same table with states to create cooperation on environmental protection and sustainable development, two issues that I cared quite a lot about. And this is me over here back in 2019. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before I go any further, I wanted to also share that I feel very grateful to have been able to grow up in Alaska as a mixed-race person. My dad is Black, and my mom is white, and my dad moved to Alaska and lived in Tanana along the Yukon River as a child, salmon fishing, and we were only able to experience the biodiversity and open landscapes and beauty of Alaska because of the indigenous peoples who have been stewarding these lands for millennia. Not only the quality of the environment, but Alaska was one of the first states to be desegregated in the United States because of the advocacy of indigenous peoples, specifically the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood. But Alaska is part of a wide diaspora of indigenous peoples from across the Arctic. And they have an incredibly long history of stewarding these lands as well. If you look at, for example, up here is Utqiagvik, the northernmost point of North America. There's evidence of people have been hunting whales and seals there because of the bone fragments and the tools that they found for at least 13,800 years. And they continue to live here and do the same livelihoods today, which means that they have been practicing these traditions for an order of magnitude longer than the Easter Island statues have been around, 2 orders of magnitude longer than the Great Wall of China has been around. And if you look at the different colors of these language groups, it's because of these big breaks in the environmental conditions. Each of these language groups is really tailored to the place where they're from, and they hold a great deal of traditional knowledge about how to care for the Arctic environment. And so, as a Black mixed-race person, I always was interested in the environment that I was growing up in, and it was crucial to me to work in solidarity with the people who have been doing this work for time immemorial, and especially since the onset of colonization, have a lot to share. So here's some photos of when I was growing up in Alaska. We spent a lot of time, like I said, fishing, hiking, camping, and doing other things in the outdoors. And I saw, as I got older, how the sites of my childhood memories were changing so rapidly and so drastically. Like when I was growing up, at Halloween time, it would always be snow on the ground. And so we always had to design our Halloween costumes to go over our snowsuits. And in 2013, 2016, 2018, and now even more rapidly, there isn't snow on the ground. It falls on average a week later than it typically has in the past. And the snow melts 2 weeks earlier than it used to. I remember going to see glaciers that now have disappeared, that you can't see from the roadside because they have receded so far. And at the same time as this was really hard for me to grapple with, seeing everything change so quickly, I knew that I was also not on the front lines of this problem. Alaska is very different from the lower 48 in that we are huge. Alaska is about 1/3 of the continental U.S. in size, and a lot of the state is not connected by road. A lot of communities are fly-in or boat-in only, which means that it's really crucially important to be able to live off the land where you come from because they're not necessarily connected to supply chains. Unlike where I grew up in Anchorage, it's a big city. We are pretty well connected to supply chains, although it's more expensive than it might be down here in the lower 48. For many Alaskans, the issue of climate change is right now and very much affecting daily life. These are just some examples. Like I mentioned, my dad had grown up on the Yukon River. Well, for the last 6 years now, Alaska Native people have not been allowed to sustain themselves off the Yukon River fish, and we're in a salmon crisis because the salmon are not returning to the rivers in the numbers that they have historically that sustain people for millennia. This is in part due to climate change because the river waters are so warm that the fish cannot swim through them, but it's also hugely due to extraction from Alaska that we have, if you all might have seen in the stores, wild salmon that you can buy, is coming out of Alaska in huge, huge numbers off the coast in the ocean before people can get them along the river. You see on the right, this is a photo, an example of permafrost thaw, because historically the ground in many parts of Alaska is frozen all year round, but because it is so warm now, the ground is literally shifting underneath entire villages. There's at least 48 villages that imminently need to be relocated because infrastructure is falling into the river or falling into the ocean. And up top, this is actually not from Alaska, but this is one way in which I can exemplify how all across the Arctic issues are interrelated, because there are caribou herds that people, especially Gwich'in in the northern part of Alaska, have relied on for many generations, but are moving because of the climate change. They haven't been returning. And this photo is of reindeer, which are genetically similar, but they're semi-domesticated by Sami people who live in what's known as Finland, the western part of Russia, the Kola Peninsula, and Norway and Sweden. And because of climate change, the traditional reindeer herding has become much more challenging, where there'll be rain on top of snow, and the reindeer can't puncture through the ice that forms in order to eat. And so this is affecting people's livelihoods. And I hope you all know that the Arctic is warming at 2 to 4 times the rate of the global average. And so these changes are happening very quickly. And they are a problem, but what makes it worse is that they are building on a history of colonization and colonialism. So this is a slide that I'm borrowing from my current employer, Native Movement. Does anyone want to read the definition of colonialism? Don't be shy. Go ahead.
I can project.
There's a recording.
The policy or practice of acquiring political control over another country, land, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. You want me to read the quotation?
Sure.
Settlers are not immigrants. Immigrants are beholden to indigenous laws and epistemologies, ways of knowing of the lands they migrate to. Settlers become the law, supplanting indigenous laws and epistemologies.
So, Alaska only became a state in 1959, and land claims were only settled in the early 1970s. And because it was such a strange arrangement for a new arrangement, there's been many changes, even in 1991 with the law Anilka in Congress, that changed how people were able to harvest from the land. I say this because this is in our parents', our grandparents' lifetime. Colonialism is very real and active in Alaska. It's not something that happened in the past. We're not post-colonial. And that Alaska was a territory since the 1800s, but the reason why Alaska didn't become a state until 1959 was because the United States, as it expanded across Turtle Island, was only allowing new states by Congress when there was enough white landowning male settlers. And so Alaska has only reached this tipping point after World War II. And So imagine, like I said, over 13,000, up to 30,000 years of history, more time than we can can even imagine. And then in the last 50 years, having taken your right to fish away, having taken your right to hunt in certain lands that are now owned by the state or owned by the federal government. So this discussion about climate change is very much linked to colonialism and colonization, which is often interchangeably used, but we like to distinguish that colonization is the process of devaluing and dehumanizing Native people in order to justify exploiting them in their homelands. That all of this colonialism would not be possible if not for the devaluing of the people and the land prior to the settlers coming. And as a Black person, this very much resonated with me because our labor has been undervalued for so long. So to see land being undervalued, they're very interconnected struggles. And if you think about climate change, there's a strong academic debate right now that the origins of climate change and the Anthropocene, which is not just the warming of the environment, but also the land use changes across the world, the decrease in biodiversity, actually started with the transatlantic slave trade, because that was the first time in human history as we know it where the Europeans completely overextended their ecological balance, where you can see in the geologic record new plants and animals across different continents that hadn't been there before. And so I very much think that the fight against colonization and colonialism is one that we can all share in, and recognizing that it's the same system that impacts us, even if the impacts are different based on who you are. And so now we'll get a little bit into the international discussion. When I first started working at the Arctic Council at the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, this was pre-COVID-19 pandemic. In 2019, after 25 years of the Arctic Council's history, during the first Trump administration, was the first time that the Arctic Council was not able to reach a joint declaration shared by the Arctic states and the 6 indigenous peoples organizations. And this is a photo of then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, because allegedly, and now much more commonly known, was that the U.S. State Department's delegation had basically come in the day or two before the declaration was to be signed and released and said that they wouldn't sign anything having to do with climate change. Anything that said climate change was against their policies. And so this past week is now the 3rd time that the Arctic Council has not been able to reach a joint declaration, in part to this America First sort of ideology, but also, there was the COVID-19 pandemic, which limited cooperation, and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which further drove the different actors apart. And I just think, though, that this is a very crucial example of coloniality that we'll see, where there has been work and cooperation going on for decades, and that then the United States came and completely devalued all the work that had been happening up to that point, and wouldn't even validate the existence of climate change, let alone any action to address it. But I learned in my travels, like I said, I wanted to see what other places were like and how they had good governance and had achieved equity. I learned in my travels that it's not just the United States that is doing this. This is in Sápmi, the traditional homelands of the Sami, in northern Norway, or what's known as northern Norway. And this was all reindeer herding land. Traditionally, Sami are nomadic, moving their reindeer from summer pastures to winter pastures. And because of climate change, Norway wanted to uptake its renewable energy. And unfortunately, most of its renewable energy was put directly in Sami homelands without the consent of the Sami. And this was really hurtful to the traditional livelihoods because reindeer wouldn't go anywhere near the wind farm. And this meant that an entire family group would no longer be able to herd their reindeer if they're not able to use the pasture lands that had been allocated to them. So this is a challenge, I think, in addressing climate change, is that we have to address the root causes of climate change in order to actually make a sustainable future. And unfortunately, what we were seeing was that the ways that we were addressing climate change was actually hurting people who live the most sustainable livelihoods. So in my time in the international sphere, I think that the most inspiring to me, not necessarily the government of Norway or the government of Iceland, were the young indigenous peoples from all across the Arctic who were gathering together to say, these are our priorities. And I'll read, this is from the 6th Arctic Leaders Summit, the 6th time that Gwich'in, Unangak, or Aleut, Inupiaq, or Inuit from across the Arctic, and Athabascans or Dene were meeting among themselves to develop what are our policy priorities, what do we want to see in the future of the Arctic. But this was the very first time in 2019 that indigenous youth from across the Arctic had gathered together to create a declaration of their priorities. If you scan that, you can read it all, but I'll read a point to you that is the opening of their declaration, which is, "We have come to an understanding that though we are separated by language, cultures, and by borders, we are all facing the same issues. All our traditional areas have been colonized by the Arctic states, and with that, our identities, knowledge, language, and health have been put to the test. It is important to recognize that these issues are not separated, but are interconnected." And I was so inspired by that when I returned to the United States and began working at the Wilson Center that Melody had mentioned, one of my proudest moments in the time that I was working there was setting up a conference called The Arctic in 25 Years, which was all virtual because it was during the COVID-19 pandemic, but it was a gathering of indigenous youth from all 8 Arctic states, from all 6 permanent participant organizations as well. And I think that it was crucial that we brought young people to speak to Washington, D.C. and Congress, which was typically who the Wilson Center's audience was, because young people are going to see climate change worsen over our lifetimes. In that way, we are the most impacted. But particularly indigenous youth from across the Arctic are the most impacted of all the people that were in this conference, because they are directly living on the lands that are changing so drastically. But it was pretty abnormal for the Wilson Center, I would say, to have an event like this. And I recall someone had mentioned decolonization of Greenland, and someone said to me, "That's so radical." But as Angela Davis says, radical simply means grasping at the root and recognizing that these issues are all interconnected and can't be solved with one-off technical solutions. This was also when my advocacy and organizing kind of took a turn, because I started to recognize, after seeing the United States in the Arctic Council, how it had behaved, and after having this experience, recognizing a difference between inside game and outside game, and high politics and low politics, meaning that high politics are what the government has to do to ensure the government's survival, and low politics is what the government has to do to ensure the people who live there's survival, and that you can only successfully do your work in inside game as long as high politics align with what you need on the ground. And so I've been working at Native Movement with a coalition called the Just Transition Collective, where we are a group of 5 different environmental organizations in Alaska that is seeking to have a post-oil future, that wants to see these issues as interconnected and include environmental and social issues as one. And this was our youth panel at the Just Transition Summit. And we've also done some really exciting projects, like one called Goth and E, where I was talking about the salmon crisis earlier. We brought together young people to work with their hands with birch and with salmon skin and making art to kind of navigate our grief for the changing climate, and ate together to build relationships, because ultimately that's what all of this work is about, is our relationships, and we can't build power unless we are knowing each other deeply. And Yo-Yo Ma, who is an award-winning prodigy cellist, came to make music with us about the changing climate in order to bring awareness to the fact that there are people still living in direct relationship with the land and have the most knowledge about how to move forward with environmental protection. So definitely recommend scanning this one, because it's a beautiful video that came out of this, directed by Princess Dasrai Johnson. And with that, I'd like to see if there are any questions.
I will ask the mic will come to you if you have a question for Michaela.
Or comments.
Or comments.
Well, first off, thank you for doing your presentation. I guess more of a question. You touched on it a little bit, but I wonder, from at least the Dartmouth perspective, with the students here, I know that there is a lot of student activism for a lot of different fields of things, including like climate change, and I'm just wondering what you think are some of the best ways for the Dartmouth community to be able to engage in some of the activism and participate in some of the issues that, or bring awareness to some of the issues, or further awareness to some of the issues that may not have been known. Because like for me specifically, I wasn't super aware of the salmon crisis. And so just learning about that, I'm just curious about ways that the Dartmouth community can like push out things, and then what other ways have that just been getting like promoted or something like that.
Yes. The salmon crisis has really gone under the radar of the rest of the United States. It wasn't until, I would say, even like a year or two ago that it started to gain a little bit of traction. And that's just from people talking about it. I think, it's hard if you're not part of a community to speak on behalf of. That's not the intent at all, is to speak on behalf of the community. But definitely, I think spreading the word is very helpful. We often don't have media coming and asking about what's happening in Alaska. And so anyone who is a writer or is a storyteller can start to build those relationships to share that knowledge. But education is one piece, but it really does start with the relationships. So for example, with the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, as a non-Indigenous person, my pathway to doing that work was to reach out to the people who have the authority in that community to make decisions. So I was sending letters to the chief of Chickaloon, Chief Gary Harrison, and saying I just wanted to learn how to be a better Alaskan. And from there, even just asking makes a big difference, because it's not that many people that ask. A lot of people come and just decide. And so start with the relationships as much as possible, but definitely talk about it as much as possible too.
Great. Hi. Thank you so much again for your talk. This was great. This is kind of a big picture question, I guess, but I know oftentimes when national or international lobbying groups or environmental protection groups step in, there isn't always consultation with Indigenous communities around traditional ideas around land use or traditional hunting and fishing, whaling, things like that. And so oftentimes good intentions go awry, I think, and groups that should probably be allied in their goals sometimes struggle to work together. And I was just wondering if those were challenges that you've seen in your work in the Arctic and or successes that you've had where Indigenous groups have been able to help reframe some of those goals or lobbying efforts with these organizations.
Yeah, it is a serious challenge because like I was mentioning, the land claims, for example, our national wildlife refuges were only set up in 1991, and they encompass a huge part of Alaska. But often environmental groups will say, we want to protect these national refuges, not recognizing also how challenging that colonial system of conservation has made just living. And so there are a lot of conflicts in this area. And we at Native Movement, our board is entirely Alaska Native women, and our staff is predominantly Native as well. But even we still come up with these challenges, and that's because Alaska is so spread out, and each community is different, and you have to make relationships in each community. But we use the HAMA's principles for democratic organizing in order to guide our work with community. So some of those are let people speak for themselves, work in solidarity and mutuality. And I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but I think that those are really useful to look toward because they were created by Indigenous peoples and environmental justice communities who had been trying to work with environmental NGOs, and exactly what you had talked about, they had stepped on their toes and taken over projects and not allowed the people who actually lived there and were frontline to be the face of the work. And so that's not per se an example, but those are some guidelines that I would recommend. And in terms of what has worked, I think the Just Transition Collective that I mentioned is one that has been an experiment, over the years of, okay, we have some similar issues that we care about. We know that we want to reduce the footprint of oil and gas in Alaska, for example. But it takes a lot of sitting around the table and figuring out where do we align and working on those things together, and holding each other accountable as well, because there are just big environmental organizations in that collective, like the Alaska Center, that are not necessarily environmental justice focused organizations.
I'll be good and use the mic.
So I have a question. I hope others have too. But something I've always thought about. I think we've talked a little bit about it. But you did such an interesting job navigating, your own personal voice. What we were just talking about, how you're not speaking on behalf of others. You're trying to understand how they think and then speak from your heart and what you believe, but also giving pathways to others, which has been, and especially with youth, Indigenous youth. Then you also went and wrote this book, and I've talked to you about this, but what is it? There's always a lot to say. Oh my gosh, I don't know enough yet. I can't write a book. I need to be, it needs to be perfect. I can't do. This may be my own therapy here. But no, how did you make that next step to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to put it out there. I'm going to give my thoughts and find my voice, even though it's still very young and new. And this is something I just find so exciting. But walk me through a little bit how that is. It just you always had that in you, or did it take some thought to do it?
Oh, that was definitely the scariest moment of my life when the book went to print. Because, I don't know everything at all. And I just felt that I knew enough to say something specifically, like having grown up in Alaska, but having gone to school in the lower 48 and met so many amazing people who care about social justice, who were like immediately wanted to know what Alaska is like. I felt like there was a group of people that I could speak to that would enjoy the life experiences that I had had. And the biggest reason that I wrote the book was because when I came back and I was talking to friends and family, their first question would be, how was Norway? I was like, I have so much to say. I couldn't talk about it in just, a 45-minute conversation or something. Now I can condense it into an hour. But at first, I didn't plan to write a book. I had this fellowship, and the fellowship required that we write a letter home every month. And so I was writing about culture shock and the things I was learning professionally, and everything was up for grabs. And so that's where I started having a body of writing. And then when I came back to the States and started trying to talk to people, I realized I could write a book about this, and had to, ask permission for some people. Specifically, I didn't want it to just be my voice, so most of the chapters in the book I co-wrote with people that I had met from across the Arctic, where I would basically make a phone call to them, and we'd record the phone call, and I would ask a bunch of questions, and then exactly the words that they had said were what went into the book as dialogue in the setting where we had actually met a year ago. And so... but even just the structure of writing a book was very challenging. So I was in a book writing program for about a year where they talked about what is a chapter and how to move from chapter to chapter and things like that. But it was very fast. It was about a 1.5 year process, and in the future I would slow it down a little. But it was during the pandemic, and so I was just on my computer all the time inside typing. Thank you.
Any other questions? Do we have one? No? Okay. Well, I just want to thank all of you for being here. Thank you online as well. And thank you so much, Michaela. You're coming back, and you're going to be part of my class. And I hope that her work, her voice continues to inspire. And I'm really excited. I've been following, and you know this. I lurk and I follow her career. So I'm going to continue doing that. And I look forward to, because I learned so much about everything you're doing, and I'm following in your footsteps in many ways. So no, it's true. I just just let her know I was on a conference call with Arctic Youth this morning. A lot of this was, you started with some of the work at the Wilson Center, with your work in the Arctic Council, with the Arctic Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, and so I will turn to you for advice and support and thanks. And so thank you again for being here, and I look forward to talking more in the future and making change with you.
Thank
you, everyone.